I know that I've beaten this topic to death, but to this day I still get comments asking me about toxic masculinity. So in one video I want to clearly and concisely explain what toxic masculinity is, where it originates from, and how it manifests. One common misconception about the phrase toxic masculinity is that it is an attempt to demonize all traits and behaviors that are associated with masculinity. It is not. Instead, it is a way of distinguishing how certain masculine characteristics, while not inherently toxic, can be expressed in toxic ways. The phrase toxic masculinity wasn't even coined by the feminist movement at all. It originates from the mythopoetic men's movement of the 1980s and 1990s. A men's movement that sought to move away from the way that traditional masculinity has been associated with dominance, aggression, and violence, and instead move towards a healthier and what they saw as a true form of masculinity. And as such, from the moment the phrase toxic masculinity was created, it was intended not to demonize masculinity, but to reclaim it. Which leads into the next point. What does toxic masculinity look like? What traits and behaviors were they attempting to move away from? For example, there's nothing wrong with being independent, but there is an issue that arises when you are so hypervigilant and stoic that you cannot ask for help when you need it. There's nothing wrong with being thick-skinned, but it is harmful when you invalidate and harass others for being sensitive, or when you suppress and bottle up your own emotions and never deal with them healthily. Especially so when those unresolved emotions result in the abuse of your spouse or your children. Or consider the way that men often construct their own self-image not based on themselves, but instead relative to all other men in their masculinity, always seeking to be the dominant one. Or the constant policing and harassment of other men for not conforming to their limited and restrictive definition of masculinity. You see, toxic masculinity is rooted in social structures. We live in a society that assigns everyone a gender at birth, as well as gender roles that they are expected to conform to. And anytime an individual has attempted to deviate from those social pressures, they have been ruthlessly discouraged. And obviously, these social norms have changed and evolved over time. They've become more inclusive. But that does not change the fact that our society was founded on ideas of patriarchy, white supremacy, and cis-heteronormativity. And because of these social structures, men are often consciously coerced or subconsciously taught to reinforce them, and to pressure others to do the same. But because of the interplay between the different social structures that I mentioned earlier, in order to truly understand toxic masculinity, you need to understand intersectionality. It is not simply that men are pressured to be masculine. It is that all people are pressured to fall into one specific category: cis-het, white, land-owning, native men. And if you do not fall under that very specific demographic, you are deemed unfavorable under these social structures. And in this way, toxic masculinity can bleed into the issues of other social structures. For example, the restrictive gender roles that we assign to white men and women are not necessarily congruent with those of other races or ethnicities, and as such, reinforcing such social standards might bleed more into white supremacy than patriarchy. Likewise, the reinforcement of restrictive gender roles on the queer community might have more to do with cis-hetero patriarchy. And as such, engaging in toxic masculinity doesn't just harm men, it harms everyone.